Good morning, students. So whether my screen is visible, I'm audible.
Yes, sir.
Right, fine. So welcome to the module 31, right, for the IC engine subject, right. So today we are going to see about the types of the lubricating oils, right. So what are the types of lubricating oils which we are used in the IC engines, right. So that type we can see, right. So before seeing this one, uh, just we can recap, right. So what are the terms we discussed in last class, right. So last class we discussed about what is the lubricant, right. So lubricant, it's a uh, it will minimizing the friction, right. It will reduce the friction by minimizing into the very minimum, right. So it will replace the solid friction into the fluid friction, right. So that term is called lubricant, right. So the lubricants will have the certain functions, right. So what are the functions are there in the lubricants, right. What are the important role of the lubricants, right. So the lubricants, it will control the friction and it will control the wear and tear, and it will control the temperature, corrosion, and it will remove it will remove the contaminants, and it will make a firm seal, right. So these are all the functional of the lubricants, right. Then we have seen the types of the lubricants, right. So generally we have three types of lubricants. So one is the liquid lubricant and quasi solid lubricants and solid lubricants, right. So for the liquid, right, so for the liquid lubricants we obtain from the refinery process of the crude oil, right. So we can get a different type of uh, products from the crude oil, right, by the refinery process. So the lubricants also a one, right, one of the product from the crude oil, right. So we can get liquid lubricants from the crude oil, right. So the crude oil is a natural one, right. And we have to produce the lubricants from the crude oil, right. And we have some synthetic also, artificially we can manufacture, artificially we can produce the lubricants, right. So the type of lubricants is called the synthetic lubricants, right. So most probably the mineral oils will be obtained from the crude oil by the refinery process, which is used as a lubricant, right. So for the application, for the requirement, right, so the only the crude oil is not enough for the lubricant, right. So it may have some different characteristics, right. So we have to mm, improve the quality, right. We have to improve the quality of the lubricant which is obtained from the crude oil, right, in natural manner, right. So we have to add some additives also. So the the crude oil which is obtained from the refinery process, from the lubricant, sorry, refinery process, and it will be added by some additive materials, and we can get some lubricant, right. So it will give the better quality, right, better quality, that is the improvement of better quality. So improvement of the lubricant characteristics, right. So in this type we have to see the liquid lubricants, and we have some solid lubricants, right. The solid lubricant means a very thin layer, a very thin layer of materials which is used, right, in between the mating parts, right. So where the lubricant, where the friction has to minimize, right. So between the mating parts we have to impose a very thin film of the materials, right. So that type of the lubricant is called the solid lubricants, right. So the quasi solid lubricants is a semi solid, that is a pasty form, that is a grease, right. So grease is a one type of the lubricant, right. So which is used for to avoid the friction between the mating parts, and it will used for uh, uh, the coolant, right. It is used as a coolant also, right. Then the characteristics, right. So what are the characteristics are important for the lubricant, right. So here the density, right. So what about the density, that is the specific gravity of the particular lubricant, and the viscosity index, right? So mainly the viscosity, right? So it's a very important one for the lubricant, right? So the viscosity which may affect by the temperature, so it is expressed, right? So depending upon the temperature, how the viscosity may varies, right? So the expression, it is in denoted by some numbers, right? That numbers is called the viscosity index. Then the 2 points, that is a pour point and the flash point, right? So these two will be depends on the temperature, right? So for the pour point, so at what temperature it will change its phases, right? So at up to what temperature it will be still in a fluid condition, right? So that temperature is called the pour temperature. And one more is the temperature, right? So up to what temperature it will be in a same manner, right? So it will be not ignited, right? So that temperature, right? So the flash temperature, when the temperature will be rises, so in a particular temperature the lubricant may get some igniting condition, right? So that temperature is called the flash point, right? So these five are the important lubricant characteristics, right? So up to this we discussed in last class. So in this class we are going to see about the lubricant additives, right? So why we have to use the lubricant additives, right? Whether my screen is visible, anyone, slide is visible or not, anyone?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
டேய் உனக்கு என்ன ஸ்லைட் தெரியுது? பிபிடி ஸ்லைட் தெரியுதா உங்களுக்கு?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, right, fine. So uh, the lubricant additives, right? So the purification and the manufacturing processes uh, impact a good quality to the lubricating oils, right? So the purification and the processes, manufacturing processes impact the good qualities to the lubricating oils, but still, right? But still, they cannot be used directly, right? So whatever may be the condition, right? So the lubricants, right, which may get from the crude oil, right? So either in the form of the mineral oils, right? So which cannot be used in a direct manner for the many applications, many requirements, right? So they will be prone to contamination and the decomposition, right, in the exacting working conditions, right? So hence the certain chemical compounds, some chemical compounds and the other agents, so we required, right? So that agent is called the additives, right? That agent is called additives. So that additives, that chemical compounds and the agents will be mixed with the lubricating oil, right? So then only we can get some good quality of the lubricating oil, right? So then only we can impact the good quality of the lubricating oil, right? So that type of the lubricating oil will be suitable for most of conditions, right? So the lubricant which is available, which is produced from the crude oil, right? So it is not used in most of conditions, right? So we can't use in a direct manner also, right? So we have to add some agents, right? We have to add some chemical compounds, right? So that chemical compounds and the agents will be called as the additives, right? So by adding these additives in a lubricating oil, we can get a good quality of the lubricating oil, right? So we can get a good quality and we can get some the lubricant characteristics. We can get some improved lubricant characteristics, right? So most of the modern lubricating additives, right? So which can be classified as these three terms, right? So these three terms we are using. So these three, right? So these three. So the first one is those that designed to protect, right? So these three, it's important, right? So those that designed to protect a lubricant in a service by maintaining the distortions, right? That one. And those that protect the lubricant from the harmful fuel consumption products, and those which improve the existing the physical properties, or it may impact the new characteristics of the lubricant, right? So these three, right? So depending upon these three classifications will be there for the most of modern lubricant additives, right? So what are the function of the additives, right? So the use of the chemical additives in the lubricant is very wide range, right? So the use of the chemical additives used in the lubricant in the nowadays is a very wide, right? So they are used in the lightest instruments, right? So and the spindle oils and the thickness, right? The thickest gray gear lubricants and the automotive lubricants, the cutting oils, then the hydraulic fluids. So these are all the applications, right? So most of the conditions, the chemical additives will be used in the lubricant in wide very range, right? So for example, for the spindle oils, right? Then the gear lubricants, automobile lubricants, cutting oils, hydraulic fluids, right? So the wide range of additives will be used, right, for the lubricants, right? So we have plenty of characteristics of the lubricating, right? So we have plenty of characteristics, plenty of properties are there in the lubricating oil, right? So for the base, right, for the base of we mentioned as a 5, right? So viscosity index, pore point, flash point, and the specific gravity or the density, right? So uh, we have over a 50 characteristics of the lubricating base oils, right? So which can be improved by some additives, right? Which can be improved by some additives, right? So generally the additives, right, must have some properties. Generally the additives will have some properties, right? Depending upon the properties we can improve, right? We can improve the characteristics of the lubricant, right? So you can see, so these are the properties, right? So these are all the properties, right, which is used of the additives for the lubricating oil. So these are the properties, right? So you can see, so for the first one is the solubility in the base petroleum oil, so which is obtained from the crude oil, right? Petroleum oil means the crude oil, right? So and it is insoluble, and the lack of reactions, right? So which occurs in the solutions, right? Then it should not impact the dark color of the oil, right? Dark color to the oil, right? So it will have some low volatility, right? So the firing, right? Then additives must be stable in blending, storage, and for the usage, right? Then the additive should not impact the favorable order, right? So these are all the properties, right? These are all the properties, right? So depending upon these properties, right? Depending upon these properties, the lubricant characteristics may be improved, right, by adding the additives in the lubricating oil, right? So the use of the additives, the antioxidant, right? Antioxidant increases the oil and the machine life, right? Which is the additives will consist of the chemical compounds and the agents, right? The chemical compounds and the agents. So here in a particular term, the antioxidant, right? The antioxidant increases the oil and the component life, right? Oil and the machine life, and it prevents the oxidation or a corrosion, right? It will prevent the oxidation and the corrosion, right? So it will protect against the chemical attack, right? It will protect against the chemical attack of an alloy, bearings, and the metal surfaces, right? So the antioxidant is a one of additives, right? Antioxidant is a one of the additives, so which will improve the uh, life of the machine component, right? Life of the machine component, and it will increase the characteristics of the lubricant, right? So particularly it prevents the oxidation, so the corrosion will be controlled, right? The corrosion will be controlled. So it will protect against the chemical attack of the bearing materials or mating surfaces, right, from the oxidation. And the second one is the digitants, right? So the cleanliness of the lubricant surfaces, right? So lubricated surfaces we can get from the cleaning of the digitants, right? Then the rust, it will eliminate the rusting, and it will preference, right? It will presence of the water and the moisture pore, right? So that we can avoid, right? So we can get a low temperature fluidity and for the viscosity index and the lower rate of change of the viscosity, right? So improver with the temperature changes, right? So these are all the use of the additives. These are all the use of the additives, right? Then you can see the types of the lubricating oils, types of the lubricating oils, right? So we may have the different type of the lubricating oils, right? So each major oil companies, right? So whatever may be the oil company, so we know Castrol is one more company, Max is one more company, right? So we have the plenty of the oil companies, right? So each major oil companies will have over the 300 different products, 300 different industrial and the automotive types in the uh, automotive types of the lubrications, right? Automotive types of in the lubrication. So we have plenty of classifications will be there, right? So in the plenty of classification I just give some about the 10 types of the lubricating oils. So for the first one is the spindle oil, the gear oil, the roller bearing oils, the electric motor oils, then the steam cylinder oils, turbine oils, air compressor oils, then the refrigeration and the compression oils, and the hydraulic oils, cutting oils, and some automotive oils, right? So these 10, right? These about 10, not only 10. How much is there? So 11, right? So I given the 11 classification of the oils, right? So each companies, right? Each companies will give the different variety of the lubricating oils, right? So which will required from the various industrial applications and some automotive applications. So we can see the one by one. So for the spindle oils, right? It gets its name itself, right? So the spindle oil. So this type of the lubricating, right? This type of the oils, the spindle oils, right? Which is used in the small rotating shafts, right? It will be used in a small rotating shafts and the upside of the drills, right? And which may have the high speed and the low load characteristics, right? So there we can use this type of oils, the spindle oils, right? So the name itself, it can be uh, defines, which is used in the spindles, right? So what is the spindle? It's a small rotating shaft on the upright the drills, right? So which may have some high speed or low speed, right? So the various speeds will be there and the various load conditions also there. So the viscosity is the most important factor here, right? The viscosity is the most important factor here. The temperatures, right? The temperatures are the should be high enough to make the flash point is critical and low enough to make the pour point is important for this spindle oils, right? Sorry. Then the gear oils, right? So the most of the terms the gear oils will be have the heavier grade, right? So the gear oils or the heavier grade, right? So because of the rubbing action of the gear teeth and the high pressure on the teeth is there, right? So the gear oils is specified as the high grade oils, that's a heavier grade oils, right? So the gear oils why? Because the rubbing action is more, right? So the gear tooth mating and it will create some pressure on the teeth. So high pressure will be on the teeth and it may have some high rubbing action on the teeth, right? So here we have to use some heavier grade of the lubricant, right? So the gear oils, right? So the gear oils is a heavier grade oils, right? So the gear oil viscosity usually in the range of uh, sorry, the viscosity, right? So the viscosity will be ranges from the 60 seconds to the 150 seconds at the 210 degree of Fahrenheit temperature, right? So the gear oil should have some anti-foam characteristics, right? So you might note the gear oils, the gear oil should have some anti-foam characteristics, and for the flash point and the pour points must be considered if the temperature that will be encountered to make these points as a critical one, right? So flash point and the for the pour points, right? So this term you have to remember in the gear oils. And the third one is the turbine oil, right? So for the turbine oil, it is the highest refined oils from the refinery process, right? It is the highest refined oils which be used in the turbine, right? So these oils should be controlled to very close tolerance, right? So very close tolerance we have to use this type of oils, right? So these oils should have the control to very close tolerance in their physical characteristics or the physical properties, right? So here the flash point is very important, right? So here the flash point is very important. Why? Because it is operating temperature. So here in the turbine the operating temperature will be very high, so we have to note the flash point is very important characteristics in the turbine oils. Then the same in the air compressor oils also, it may be same in the oil compressor also, right? So here also we have to see the flash point, right? So why? Because here also that the temperature will be developed is very more, right? So the temperature developing is very more. So in the air compressor oil also we have to see the flash point is a very important characteristic, right? So anyway, these type of the air compressor oils, uh, and these have to work under the very difficult conditions, right? So it may have some very difficult condition of the work, right? So under these conditions the oil comes into contact with the high temperatures and the pressures, right? Why? Because the compressors, right? So for the compression we can get some high pressure and the temperature, right? So it will causes, right, it will causes some oxidation. Why? Because the air, right? So from the air we have some atmospheric air have to compress, right? So in the compression we may cause, right? So it is very chance to get some inner components may get some oxidation, right? So that lubricant will avoid the oxidation conditions, right? So that we have to remember in the air compressor oils. Then the refrigeration compression oil. So here also where and all the compression, where and all the high temperature will be developed, right? Though there we have to see the flash point is a very critical one. The flash point is a very important characteristics of the fluid, right? So that we have to see, right? So where and all the high heat will be generated, right? So for the gear we can get the high heat generation, and for the turbine we can get the high heat, and for the air compressor and the refrigeration compressor, right? So generally the compressor it will get some high pressure and the high temperature will maybe develops, right? So the flash point and the pour points are very important characteristics, right? Because of the temperature, right? So here also we can use the straight the mineral oils, that is the plain mineral oil we can prefer for the refrigeration compressor oils. Then the general bearing oils, right? So in the general bearing oils we have to see the viscosity is an important property. Why? Because for the bearing, so what will happen, it will be continuously rotates, right? It will be continuously rotates at the high speed and the different speeds and the different load conditions, right? So the temperature may be a considered one, so the viscosity index may be varies, right? So for that condition we have to use the different type of the lubricating oils in the bearings, right? So the general bearing oils will be the same. So we have a six classification on the oils, right? Six classification on the bearing oils, so that we can see in the latest classes, right? So these are the very important terms, right? So these are the very important terms of the types of the hydraulic oils, right? So here I mentioned the gear spindle oil, the gear oil, general oil, and the turbine oil, air compressor oil, and the refrigeration oil, and we have some automotive oils, right? In this automotive oils also the characteristics of the lubricant, that is the five characteristics are the very important one, right? So the pour point, flash point, viscosity and viscosity index, and the density of the lubricant, right? So depending upon the applications we have to use Depending upon the requirement, we have to use the different type of the lubricating oils for the specified conditions. Then we have the lubrication systems in the IC engine, right? So up to this we have seen in a general manner, right? So in a general manner, we have to see what is the lubricant, what is the lubricating oils, and what are the additives, right? So we have see in a general term, right? So now we have to enter into the specific one, right? So for the IC engines, right? So the lubrication system of the IC engines, right? So in the IC engine, what are the types of the lubricating system which may be used, right? So that we can see in the IC engines, right? So for the IC engines, what are the lubrication systems are there, right? So it may be classified in the three terms, right? One is the mist lubrication system, and second one is the wet and the dry sump, right? So one is the wet sump and the dry sump, and we have some mist lubrication system, right? A mist lubrication system, right? So in the wet sump lubrication system, we have sub classification of these three, right? So one is the splash and the semi pressure and the full pressure, right? So splash, semi pressure, and the full pressure lubrication will be there, right? So it's an important question, right? So it is the important question, what is the types of the lubricating system is there, right? So each question, it's a individual 8-mark question. So each will be the individual 8-mark question in the point of examination view, right? In the point of the examination view, so the each will be a different type of question, right? Different type of the 8-mark questions, right? So short brief questions, right? So these are all the short brief question, right? So for the 2-mark question, the classification of the lubrication systems which is used in the IC engine. So we have 3 lubrication systems. So what is that? So the mist lubrication system, then wet sump and dry sump, right? So in that wet sump we have the three, so depending on upon the pressure, right? So the full pressure, semi pressure, and the splash, right? So this you have to remember, right? So now we can see the mist lubrication system, right? What is the mist lubrication system, right? So you may see, right? For example, the TVS Champ and the Excel Super, right? What's the difference between the Excel Chamber, that is the scooters, right? So earlier days you may seen, right? So while giving the petrol to the engine, we have to add some lubricating oils, right? So nowadays also we can put the oil, right, in a petrol tank itself for the particular engines, right? So whether it is correct or not, have you seen this or not? So for the Excel Super or for the TVS Excel or TVS Champ, have you heard the scooters vehicle? Anyone?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
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 sir.
yes. So in that, right. So in the TVS Champ, right? So while putting the petrol to the vehicle, so we may add some lubricating oils in the petrol tank itself, right? So the percentage will be very minimum, right? So 2 to 3% of the lubricating oil which is poured, right, which is mixed with the fuel, right? So it is mixed with the fuels, right? So this type of the lubrication is called the mist lubrication system, right? So mist lubrication system, it's a very simple type of the lubrication, it is a very simple type of a lubrication. So we have to add the small quantity of the lubricating oil, so preferably in the gasoline engines, right? So preferably for the gasoline engines, right? So the lubricating oils, right? So a very minimum of the lubricating oils will be mixed with the fuels, right? So where the fuel, air, and the lubricating oils are mixed together in the carburetor itself, right? So the fuel and air mixture, and it may have some lubricating also, it may have some lubricating oil also, right? So this type of the mist lubrication systems will be preferred for the two-stroke engines, right? So which is used in a right, sorry, which is used in the two-stroke engine, right? So the gasoline, uh, the gasoline is vaporized, and the oil in the form of the mist is entered into the cylinder via the crankcase, that is the crank bases, right? So for the crank base it will be enters, right? So the droplet of the oil, right, it strikes to the crank base. That droplets of the oil strikes the crank base, the lubricate the main connecting rod and the piston rings may get some lubricating, right? So the rest of the remaining lubricants, right? So it will be passing through the piston and the piston rings, right? And passing through the piston and the piston rings, right? So this type of system is most probably preferred in two-stroke engines, where the crank based lubrication, when it is not suitable, right? So when it is not required, right? So that type of system, we prefer the mist lubrication system, right? So in the two-stroke engines, right, the charges is partially compressed in a crankbase, right? In the two-stroke engine, it will be partially compressed in the crankbase itself. So it is not possible to have the oils in the crankbases, right? So you may remember the diagram, how the two-stroke engines will be works. Have you remember the diagram? Just wait, I will put some diagram. Correct. So you may see this diagram. Anyone answer?
தெரியுது சார்.
தெரியுதா? PPT இந்த animation தெரியுதா?
Yes, sir.
Right. So here you can see the crankcase, right? So how the crankcase will be there. So in the two-stroke engine, so we may get some inlet, right? So inlet will be opened from this charge. You may see the inlet will be passing through this chamber, right? So the air and fuel will be mixed in the cases, right? So in this case, right, so most probably what will happen means, in the splash system or a wet sump or any other lubrication system, the lubricating oil will be splashed by the crank place. So in that the lubricating oil so the crank, when the crank will be rotates, what will happen, the oil will be splashes into the piston or upper portion of the cylinder, right? But in most of the two-stroke engine, it is not possible, right? Why? Because the crankcase will be a sealed one, right? The crankbase will be a sealed one. So what will happen? The inlet charges will be comes into the crankcase, and it will be compressed, right? It will be compressed, and it will be passing through the transfer port to the combustion chamber, right? So in this type of the two-stroke engine, in this type of the two-stroke engine, there is no possible to put lubricating oils in a crankbase, right? So preferably this type of the engines, right? So we may add the lubricating oils, right? We may add the lubricating oils in the term of the carburetor, right? So the mist will be mixed, right? So the air and fuel mixture will get the fuels, that the oils also, right? So this type of the system. So that type of system is called the, it is not preferred, right? So for the most of the two-stroke engines, right, most of the two-stroke engines, we didn't have the lubrication, right? So we didn't have the base, that so in the crank base we can't store the fuel, that is the oil, right? We can't store the oil, right? So in this type, in this type of engines, so most of in this type of engine we can prefer the mist type, the lubrication system, right? So in this mist type lubrication system we have some advantages also, right? So what does that mean? It's a very simple and low cost and maintenance will be free, right? So why? Because so here there is no oil pump, oil filter, and the oil requirement terms, right? So there is no oil tank, right? So no, there is no oil pump and there is no filter, right? So here the oil will be poured directly to the fuel tank itself, right? So the some amount of, it's a very minimum amount of the lubricant oil will be mixed with the fuel, right? So that only the advantage, but we have plenty of disadvantages, right? We have plenty of disadvantages, right? So due to this disadvantages, we just preferred for the other lubrication systems, right? We prefer for the other lubrication system. So these are all the disadvantages. So during the combustion of the engine, some lubricating oils also burned one, right? So some lubricating oils also burn. Why? Because the lubricating oil will be mixed with the air and fuel mixture, right? So for the heavy exhaust, right? So it will gives the heavy exhaust or heavy emissions. So it will be deposits on the piston crown also, right? So why we have to use the piston crowns? So the for the air movement, right? For the air movement, so for the turbulence, right? So we have to give some piston crown, right? So in the piston crown also it will be deposits, right? So the oil films will be deposited on the piston crown. So that's a very main disadvantage, right? Since the lubricating oils is come to contact with some acid vapor, right? So it will produce during the combustion, so it may get some contaminations, right? So it will results, the engine parts may get some corrosion, right? So engine parts may get some corrosion on the surfaces, right? So it's also a disadvantage one, right? Then the vehicle will be moving in the downhills, right? So the throttling is almost closed, right? Why? Because we can't give any throttling. Why? Because the vehicle will be moves in a downward, right, direction, in the downward direction or the downhill direction, right? So there is the almost the throttle will be closed. At that time what will happen? The engine suffers the lack of the lubrication, so it will develop some more friction, right? It will develop more friction, right? So once we stop the throttle, what will happen? We supply the air and fuel mixture will be supplied, sorry, the air and fuel mixture will be stopped, right? So from the carburetor, right? So if the air fuel mixture will be stopped, what will happen? So obviously the lubricating oil also is stopped, right? So the friction will be developed more, right? So it's a very important drawback, right? It's a very important drawback for the mist lubrication system, right? And then the consumption of the oil is very high, right? So why? Because in the two stroke engine, the normal working conditions, so it may have some over oiled, right? So the consumption of the oil is very high, right? So these are all the disadvantages of the mist lubrication system, right? Because of this disadvantages, we can prefer the other lubrication system. We can prefer for the other lubrication systems, that is the wet sump lubrication or a dry sump lubrication is a preferable one for the IC engines, right? So most of the engines we stopped the mist lubrication systems, right? Mist lubrication system, but in some engines, right? Some two-stroke engines, we may have some this type of lubrication system, mist lubrication systems, right? So up to this, we can stop this class. So the remaining the terms will be discussed in the next class, right? So up to this, do you have any doubt? Up to this, do you have any doubt? Anyone? No.